The hot hailstones, which, at Moses' intersection, had remained suspended in the air when they were about to fall upon the Egyptians, were now cast down upon the Canaanites. These words mean that a part of the meteorites of the cometary train of the days of Exodus remained in the celestial sphere for about 50 years, falling in the days of Joshua and in the valley of Beth-Horon. On the same afternoon when the sun and the moon stood still for the length of a full day, the language of the Talmud and the Midrash suggests that the same comet returned after some 50 years. Once more it passed very close to the earth. This time, it did not reverse the poles of the earth. It kept the terrestrial axis tilted for a considerable length of time. Again, the world was, in the language of the rabbis, consumed in the whirlwind, and all the kingdoms tottered. The earth quaked and trembled from the noise of thunder. Terrified mankind was decimated once more, and carcasses were like rubbish in this day of anger. On the day when this took place on the earth, the sky was in confusion. Stones fell from the heavens. Sun and moon stopped in their paths, and a comet must also have been seen. Habakkuk describes the portent in the sky on that memorable day when, in his words, the sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. It had the form of a man on a chariot drawn by horses, and was regarded as God's angel. In the King James Version, the passages read, "His glory covers the heaven. His brightness was light. He had horns coming out of his hand. Burning coals went forth at his feet. He drove asunder the nations. Everlasting mountains were scattered. Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? And thou didst ride upon thine horses, and thy chariots of salvation? Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers.
The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by.
The deep uttered his voice. The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of thy arrows they went, at the shining of thy glittering spear. Thou didst march through the land of indignation. Thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Thou didst walk through the sea with thine horses, through the heap of deep waters. Since the text of the scriptures have, for some psychological reason, rooted in the readers the quality of being easily misread, misunderstood, or misinterpreted, I give also some of the passages of the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk in another modernized reading. Friction of displaced strata and magma must have set the world on fire. The world burned. The Greek story of Phaethon will be introduced here because of the interpretation heard by Solomon during his visit to Egypt. Phaethon. The Greeks, as well as the Carians and other peoples on the shores of the Aegean Sea, told of a time when the sun was driven off its course and disappeared for an entire day, and the earth was burned and drowned. The Greek legend says the young Phaethon, who claimed parentage of the sun, on that fatal day tried to drive the chariot of the sun, Phaethon. The chariot of the sun. Phaethon was unable to make his way against the whirling poles, and their swift axis swept him away. Phaethon in Greek means the blazing one. Many authors have dealt with the story of Phaethon. The best-known version is a creation of the Latin poet Ovid. The chariot of the sun, driven by Phaethon, moved no longer in the same course as before. The horses break loose from their course and rush aimlessly, knocking against the stars set deep in the sky and snatching the chariot along through uncharted ways. Constellation of the cold bears tried to plunge into the forbidden sea, and the sun's chariot roamed through unknown regions of the air. It was borne along just as a ship driven before the headlong blast, whose pilot has let the useless rudder go and abandoned the ship to the gods and prayers. The earth bursts into flames, the highest parts first, and splits into deep cracks, and its moisture is all dried up. The meadows are burned to white ashes. Trees are consumed, green leaves and all, and the ripe grain furnishes fuel for its own destruction. Great cities perish with their walls, and the vast conflagration reduces whole nations to ashes. The woods are ablaze with the mountains. Etna is blazing boundlessly, and the twin-peaked Parnassus, nor does it chilling climb save Scythia, Caucasus burn. In the heaven-piercing Alps, the cloud-capped Apennines, the scorched cloud belched forth smoke. Pantheon seized the earth aflame. He can no longer bear the ashes of the whirling sparks, was completely shrouded in dense hot smoke. In this pitchy darkness, he cannot tell where he has been, or whither he is going. It was then, as men think, the people of Ethiopia became black-skinned. Since the blood was drawn to the surface of their skin by the intense heat. Then also Libya became a desert, for the heat dried up her moisture. The Don's waters steamed. Babylonian, Euphrates, and the Ganges. Faces, Danube, Alpheus boil. Spirtios are aflame. The golden sands of Tagus melt in the heat, and the swans are scorched. The Nile fled in terror to the ends of the earth. The 7 mouths lie empty, filled with dust. 7 broad channels, all without a stream. The same mischief dries up the Thracian rivers, Hebrus, Strymon, also the rivers of the west, the Rhine, Rhone, Po, and the Tiber. Great cracks yawn everywhere. Even the sea shrinks up. And what was but now a great watery expanse is a dry plain of sand. The mountains, which the deep sea had covered before, spring forth and increase the number of the scattered Cyclades. How could the poets have known that a change in the movement of the sun across the firmament must cause a world conflagration, blazing of volcanoes, boiling of rivers, disappearance of seas, birth of deserts, emergence of islands, if the sun never changed its harmonious journey from sunrise to sunset? The disturbance in the movement of the sun was followed by a period as long as a day, when the sun did not appear at all. Ovid continues, if we are to believe the report, 1 whole day went without the sun, but the burning world gave light. A prolonged night in one part of the world must be accompanied by a prolonged day in another part. In Ovid we see the phenomenon related to the book of Joshua, but from another longitude. This may stimulate surmise as to the geographical origin of the Indo-Iranian or Carian migrant to Greece. The globe changed the inclination of its axis. Latitudes change, too. Ovid ends the description of the world catastrophe contained in the story of Phaethon, causing all things to shake with her mighty trembling. The earth sank back a little lower than her wonted place. Plato recorded the story heard 2 generations before from Solon, the wise ruler of Athens. Solon, on his visit to Egypt, questioned the priests versed in the lore of antiquity on early history. He discovered that neither he himself nor any other Greek knew anything at all
that one might say about such matters. Solon unfolded before the priest the tale of the deluge, the only ancient tradition he was aware of. One of the priests, an old man, said, "There have been, and there will be, many and diverse destructions of mankind, of which the greatest are by fire and water, and lesser ones by countless other means. For in truth the story that is told in your country as well as ours, how once upon a time Phaethon, son of Helios, yoked his father's chariot, and because he was unable to drive it along the course taken by his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and himself perished by a thunderbolt. The story, as it is told, has the fashion of a legend, but the truth of it lies in the occurrence of a shifting of the bodies in the heavens, which move around the earth, and a destruction of the things on the earth by fierce fire, which recurs at long intervals." The Egyptian priests explained to Solon that in these catastrophes the literary works of many peoples and their learned men perish. For that reason, the Greeks were still childish, as they no longer knew the true horrors of the past. These words of the priest were only an introduction to a revelation of his knowledge about the lands that were erased, when Greece also and the entire world were visited with heavenly wrath. He told the story of a mighty kingdom on a great island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that submerged and sank forever into its waters. End of subchapter.
Atlantis. The story narrated by Plato of the island of Atlantis that ruled Africa as far as the border of Egypt and Europe, as far as Tuscany, on the Apennine Peninsula, and that in one fatal night was shattered by earthquakes and sank, never ceased to occupy the imagination of the literary. Strabo and Pliny thought that the story of Atlantis was an illusion of the elderly Plato, but to this day the tradition, as received by Plato, as revived by Plato, has not died. Poets and novelists have exploited the story freely. Scientists have done so with caution. An incomplete catalogue of the literature on Atlantis in 1926 included 1,700 titles. Although Plato said clearly that Atlantis was situated behind the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean, as is also indicated by the name of the island. Travelers and other guessers have placed Atlantis in all parts of the world, even on dry land, as for example in Tunisia, Palestine, South America, Ceylon, Newfoundland, and Spitsbergen have also been considered. This was due to the fact that traditions of inundations and submersion of islands exist in all parts of the world. Plato set down what Solon had heard in Egypt from the learned priests. The Atlantic Ocean there was, at that time, navigable, for in front of the mouth, which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Hercules, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia Minor together, and it was possible for travelers of that time to cross from it to the other islands, and from the islands to the whole of the continent, over against them, which encompasses that veritable ocean. Yonder is the real ocean, and the land surrounding it may most rightly be called, in the fullest and truest sense, a continent. Now in this island of Atlantis there existed a confederation of kings, a great and marvelous power. which held sway over all the island and over many other islands also in parts of the continent, and moreover of the lands here within the straits. They ruled over Libya as far as Egypt and over Europe as far as Tuscany. In the 19th century, ships sailed the Atlantic Ocean to explore its bed in search of Atlantis. And before the Second World War, scientific societies existed for the sole purpose of exploring the problem of the sunken island. Much speculation was offered, not only on the whereabouts of Atlantis, but also on the cultural achievements of its inhabitants. Plato, in another work of his, Critias, wrote a political treatise, and as no real place in the world could have been the scene of his utopia, he chose for that purpose the sunken island. Modern scholars, finding some affinity between American and Egyptian and Phoenician cultures, think that Atlantis may have been the intermediary link. There is much probability in these speculations. If they are justified, Crete, a maritime base of carrion navigators, may disclose some information about Atlantis as soon as the Cretan scripts are satisfactorily deciphered. I wonder if that's where the word Cretan comes from. As of right now, 2018, I haven't heard anything about it. I have to look into that. One point in Plato's story about the submersion of Atlantis requires correction. Plato said that Solon told the story to Critias the elder, and that the young Critias, Plato's friend, heard it from his grandfather when he was a 10-year-old boy. Critias the younger remembered having been told that the catastrophe which befell Atlantis happened 9,000 years before. There is 1 0 too many there. We do not know of any vestiges of human culture aside from that of the Neolithic age, nor of any navigating nation 9,000 years before Solon. Numbers we hear in childhood easily grow in our memory, as do dimensions. When revisiting our childhood home, we are surprised at the smallness of the rooms. We had remembered them as much larger. Whatever the source of the error, the most probable date of the sinking of Atlantis would be the middle of the second millennium, 900 years before Solon, when the earth twice suffered great catastrophes. And as a result of the shifting of the heavenly bodies, these words of Plato receive the least attention, though they deserve the greatest. The destruction of Atlantis is described by Plato as he heard it from his source. At a later time here occupied portentous earthquakes and floods. One grievous day and night befell them, when the whole body of your Greek warriors was swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Wherefore also the ocean at that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked up by a shoal, mud, which the island created as it settled down. At the time when Atlantis perished in the ocean, the people of Greece were destroyed. The catastrophe was ubiquitous. As if recalling what had happened, the psalmist wrote, "Destructions are come to a perpetual end, and thou hast destroyed cities. Their memorial is perished with them." He prayed also, "God is our refuge and strength. Therefore will not we fear.
Though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the sea." The floods of Deucalion and Ogyges. The history of Greece knows 2 great natural catastrophes, the floods of Deucalion and of Ogyges. One of them, usually that of Deucalion, is described by the Greek authors as having been simultaneous with the conflagration of Phaethon. The floods of Deucalion and Ogyges brought overwhelming destruction to the mainland of Greece and to the islands around that caused changes in the geographical profile of the area. That of Deucalion was most devastating. Water covered the land and annihilated the population. According to the legend, Only 2 persons, Deucalion and his wife, remained alive. Sounds familiar? This last detail must not be taken more literally than similar statements found in descriptions of great catastrophes all around the world. For example, 2 daughters of Lot, who hid with him in a cave after the catastrophe of Sodom and Gomorrah, believe that they and their father were the only survivors in the land. Chronologists, among the fathers of the church, found material for assuming that one of the 2 catastrophes, the flood of Deucalion or that of Ogyges, had been contemporaneous with the Exodus. Julius Africanus wrote, "We affirm that Ogyges, from whom the first flood in Attica derived its name, and who was saved when many perished, lived at the time of the Exodus of the people from Egypt along with Moses." He further expressed his belief in the coincidence. I wonder why he would do that. What would inspire him to write that? And how would he know? He further expressed his belief in the coincidence of the catastrophe of Ogyges and the one that occurred in Egypt in the days of the Exodus, in the following words: Passover and the Exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt took place, and also in Attica the flood of Ogyges. And that is according to reason. For when the Egyptians were being smitten in the anger of God with hail and storms, it was only to be expected that certain parts of the earth should suffer with them. Eusebius placed the flood of Deucalion in the conflagration of Pithon in the 52nd year of Moses' life. Augustine also synchronized the flood of Deucalion with the time of Moses. He assumed that the flood of Ogyges took place earlier. The chronologist of the 7th century, Isidore, Bishop of Seville, dated the flood of Deucalion in the time of Moses. Chronologists of the 17th century likewise calculated that the flood of Deucalion took place in the time of Moses. Close to, but not simultaneous with the Exodus. It would seem to be more probable that if the catastrophes occurred one shortly after the other, the catastrophe of Ogyges took place after that of Deucalion, which practically destroyed the land, depopulated it, and erased every memory of what had happened up to that time. In the words of Plato, who quoted the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon, the catastrophes must have escaped the notice of the future generations because, as a result of the devastation, for many generations, the survivors died with no power to express themselves in writing. The memory of the catastrophe of Ogyges would have vanished in the catastrophe of Deucalion if Ogyges had preceded Deucalion. Apparently, the truth is with those who place the catastrophe of Deucalion in the days of Exodus. But those who reckoned that Ogyges was a contemporary of Moses were also correct, except that Moses did not live until the flood of Ogyges. It took place in the days of Joshua. In commemoration of the Deucalion flood, the people of Athens observed a feast in the month of Anthestion, which is a spring month. The feast was called Anthestria on the 13th of the month, the main day of the feast. Honey and flour were poured into a fissure in the earth as a sacrifice. The date of this ceremony, the 13th day of Anthestria, in the spring, is revealing if we remember what was said in the section entitled 13. It was on the 13th day of the spring month of Eve that the great planetary contact occurred, which preceded by a few hours the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Isn't that amazing? The offering of honey and flour as the main ceremony of the feast is also revealing if we recollect that manna, or heavenly corn, tasting like honey, fell on the earth after the contact of the earth with a celestial body. So first it drops honey, and then it drops acid. To the province of the name Deucalion, scholars admit it is not known for the name of the person of Ogyges. We have some concrete information. Although Ogyges was a king, the Greek annalist who wrote of the flood of Ogyges as one of the outstanding events of the past of their country, at the same time did not know anything about a king of that name in Greece. Who was Ogyges? We can solve this problem. When the Israelites under Moses approached the border of Moab, I'm thinking he's a giant. Balaam and his blessings of Israel used these words. His king shall be higher than Agag. Agag must have been the most important king of that time in the area, around the eastern Mediterranean. Seems to me I remember that giants were given the name Agag at some point. In my reconstruction of ancient history, I shall put forward proofs that the Amalekite king Agag I was identical with the Hyksos king, whose name the Egyptologists tentatively read Apop I, and who, a few decades after the invasion of Egypt by the Amu Hyksos, laid the foundation of Thebes, the future capital of the new kingdom in Egypt. In conformity with this assertion, I can point to the fact that Greek tradition, which does not know of any activities of King Ogyges in Attica, occasionally places the domicile of Ogyges in Egyptian Thebes, and Acilius calls Thebes of Egypt the Ogygian Thebes, to differentiate it from the Greek Thebes in Boeotia. Ogyges is also credited with the founding of Thebes in Egypt.
Agag was a contemporary of the aging Moses. He was a ruler who in his time had no equal in the region bordering the eastern Mediterranean, a catastrophe in the time of Joshua, successor to Moses, was called by his Agag's name. The assertion of Silenus, the author of Polyhistor, that the flood of Ogyges was followed by a night 9 months' duration does not necessarily signify a confusion with the darkness that ensued after the cataclysm of the Exodus. As the causes were similar results must have followed. The eruption of thousands of volcanoes would suffice to produce this darkness of a shorter duration
than which followed the cataclysm of the Exodus.
Thus, the Greek traditions of the Ogyges, Deucalion, contain elements which, though interchanged, can be traced to two great upheavals in the middle of the second millennium before the present era.
Velikovsky's warning rings truer than ever. Just as Velikovsky says, are we not in a predicament?